Hey everyone, welcome to DevOps Unbound. I'm Alan Shimel, CEO and founder of TechStrong Group. And DevOps Unbound is a semi-monthly, which means it's twice a month, I think, video series that we've been doing now for about 3 years, and we explore every nook and cranny of the DevOps universe. For 3 years, we've been producing and putting on this show in partnership with our good friends at Tricentis, who I couldn't think of a better partner to partner on this kind of thing with. If you're not familiar with Tricentis, worldwide leader in continuous testing and so much more today. And as I said, we do these shows twice a month. And then maybe once a month or once every month and a half, we do what we call a live roundtable version of these shows, where we invite you, our studio audience, to come in and participate and kind of lead the discussion. Unfortunately, this is not a live one. This is a pre-recorded version that we did here at TechStrong Studios. But you should pay attention. Well, if you ever go to techstrong.tv and you can see the schedules of our live events of these, and we'd love to see you at the next live roundtable we do. Actually, Mitch, while I'm talking, maybe if you can grab a time and date, and when I come to you, you can even
we'll do that.
Put a little plug in. But before we come to Mitch, though, besides thanking Tricentis, I want to introduce what this particular episode is about and introduce our panel. Today's episode is API first and API testing. We're going to explore all things around API here. You know, API traffic represents the majority of the traffic on the internet. I've seen numbers as high as 83%, which is the last one that came out of Akamai. I've seen Cloudflare. I think they had it around 70%. So no matter whose statistic you go with, it's still a majority of the traffic on the internet. We're going to talk about API first development, and we are going to talk about API testing and more. Our Crackerjack production team has already gotten me the date for our next live roundtable. And if you're interested in attending this, mark your calendars now. It's on July 24th at 11 a.m. And we're going to be talking about adopting a DevOps culture for cloud migration success. Is there such a thing as cloud migration success? We'll talk about that July 24th. Let's stick to APIs today. For now, though, let me introduce to you our panel. First, I want to, he's a repeat, meaning he's been here before with us. I want to introduce you to Chris Colosimo. I hope I pronounced that right, Chris.
Sorry.
Chris, tell our audience a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, so I'm Chris Colosimo. For the last 12 years, I've been working specifically in the API testing and service virtualization space. Joined the Tricentis team recently, kind of tasked with the responsibility of uplifting and modernizing some of the service virtualization tooling. And as a natural part of that, there's some API testing pieces of it. But I've been kind of enjoying that and having fun imagining what this tooling could look like if we started from fresh. So happy to be here.
Happy to have you on, Chris. Thanks and welcome back. Next up, the kind of queen of the ball here. She, you know what? I just feel like she should move to Florida already. Our good friend, Tracy Ragan, who's also CEO of DeployHub and many other things. Tracy, why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, Alan, thank you for having me here. I always enjoy this. I feel like I should have a PhD, though, on some of the topics that you bring me in on.
Sometimes
I kind of blow myself away by understanding more than I realize. I guess I've been in this business for quite some time, to be quite honest. I started as a programmer on Wall Street, started a company called OpenMake Software that automated builds. And now I'm CEO of DeployHub, and we're doing an evidence store around security and DevOps data. I've been involved in the Eclipse Foundation, the OpenSSF, and the Continuous Delivery Foundation, and have embraced open source for quite some time and have some opinions on API first. And so I'm happy to talk about it.
Doesn't surprise me you have some opinions, Tracy. Thanks and welcome. Our third panel member is Chris Lindsey, and this is Chris's first time. I haven't yet told him of what first-time guests have to do when they first come on here, but we'll tell him in a little bit. Hey, Chris, welcome. Introduce yourself to the audience.
Alan, thank you for having me. My name is Chris Lindsey. I am an application security evangelist over at Mend. My job is just to talk about application security in general. My history, I wrote software for 35 years, so been there and done it in the trenches, and APIs are near and dear to me. And I've been in security for over 15 and plus. So thank you.
Good, and welcome. Always nice working with the folks at Mend. Our last panel, well, he's not really a panel member, but our last person I'm going to introduce is my co-host for DevOps Unbound. He's our CTO here at TechStrong. He's also a CTA for Futurum Group, which is a company we are in the process of combining with. Mitchell can explain what the CTA role is, but let me introduce you to Mitchell Ashley. Mitchell, take it.
Good to be here, Alan, and what a group! What a fantastic group! Yeah, I'll be your panelist. I'll be your co-host. I'll be the chat guy. I'll be the bottle watch. Whatever you need me to be, Alan, I'll be. So, no, just recently, as part of our acquisition process with Futurum, my role's expanded. In addition to doing the analyst work that I was doing with TechStrong Research, it's have a new, we had to create a new title, right? But I'm one of 5 people that are Chief Technology Advisors, which is kind of a glorified analyst on steroids, doing advisory work and analyst work and things like that. So it's a lot of fun that being part of the acquisition and still working with all my old friends as well as new friends. So it's good to be here with everybody. And yes, I started as a developer, and yes, I've designed some really bad APIs and a few good ones. So we have some lessons that I can bring.
Learn more on the bad ones. But anyway, thanks, Mitch, and welcome. So as I mentioned, API traffic today represents a clear majority, if not a critical mass of traffic on the internet. And I'm going to ask someone to explain what that means to the lay folks out there who may not, we don't have that many lay folks, but people who may not understand. It's either API generated or API to API kind of thing, or somewhere along the line there's an API involved in there, that traffic. But, the effect that an API first mentality has had on the development process in general, on testing and security in particular, has been pretty profound, right? I remember the first time like this whole thing became clear to me, I had that eureka sort of moment. I was at a CA World. So that should give you an idea of how long ago this was. And they had done an acquisition, a company based in Texas, and the folks from that got up and said, it's an API-driven economy. And I was like, wow, an API-driven economy? What the heck does that mean? And I learned more, and I dove in with it, and I realized it was an API. We were moving into an API-driven economy when we talk about digital transformations and stuff like that. And, I think the next logical extension to that was API first, right? That's the default. And following from that, of course, if you're going to have that kind of API footprint, you damn well better be doing API testing, right? To make sure this stuff works and make sure. And then in the last 4 or 5 years, API security has become paramount in many ways, right? API security is replacing web application firewalls and stuff like that, because WAFs, that API traffic kind of flows under the radar of the WAF, right? And so we need something else to kind of make sure our APIs are secure and locked down. Enough to make your head spin. Chris C, if it's okay, right? We'll say Chris C and Chris L. Chris C, why don't you take a crack at explaining in your mind what API first means when we use it in this context?
Absolutely. And to get there, I think I want to touch a little bit on that API economy, because that's really like first and foremost for me what's driving the API first initiative. And just unironically, about an hour ago, I was just talking with ESRI. They're the guys that do a lot of the map APIs. They were kind of behind MapQuest back in the day. And I was talking to the guy, and he was saying that before that, way before that, they were the ones that powered the Thomas guides. You remember those things that were under your seat in your car, right? And we were a logistics company, right? We had a database full of rich maps that we would then compile into a book, and we were a logistics company. Let's ship them. And then eventually, at some point, that just went away. And now they are an API first company. They sell their API to Google Maps and to Apple Maps. And so their entire economy is based around their map API. And so to me, that's what the API economy really means is businesses are building their brands, and a lot of what's powering that is the API. And if that is the critical path to your business, you really have to have an API first mentality when it comes to building them, securing them, testing them, validating them, and really, most importantly, securing them. And so that's, to me, what API first kind of means.
Panel thoughts on that?
Okay. If I can jump, I'm going to jump in on that too. I love how you set it up, Chris C. Because you think about it historically, APIs were the things you might add for the exterior of your application or your software to kind of the ingress and egress, but everything inside of it was your app, right? And API first is just the opposite. Your app is all run through APIs, even if you don't have a GUI, your UI user interface. As a matter of fact, if you do have a UI, the UI talks APIs to your app. So the same APIs that you might share with providers or people that are buying your service. Matter of fact, your service may be just the APIs like Chris is talking about. And in doing that, I remember APIs just getting kind of unwieldy and getting out of control just because we added them where we needed them here, and how long are they going to be good? And do we, as they evolved, how do we grandfather old versions of them? And now we have whole philosophies around the life cycle of APIs and how you manage them. And we think of APIs as the product, because every app now is exposing those APIs either in a microservices world, very heavily API, or also to the external world, to people that are buying our products and services. So I hope that does justice to what you were talking about, Chris C.
And while that companies do rely on external APIs. If I'm thinking about what our architecture looks like, we probably have 20% or 25, maybe 30% of external APIs, but most of what we do is internal APIs. And building internal APIs has there is some, and when I think of API first, I think about what APIs do we need? Let's think about what that looks like. And I like to refer to, I preach often this concept of domain-driven design and understanding what are your domains, what APIs do you need, what are the connection points, what does that need to look like before you ever start writing an application. But for the most part, to be quite honest, this is not a new concept. We tried to do this in C++ and common libraries. A lot of companies, when I was working for Discover Card, we did a ton of work around initially defining what those common libraries should look like. And that's really what APIs are. They're common libraries, what we can reuse. And really taking the time to understand what those high-level domains are and what we need to create is super critical in building a true kind of API first forward-thinking model. And that's because if you don't do that, and if you don't manage them well, and you don't communicate and collaborate well, everybody writes their own APIs that do the same thing. Mm-hmm. And that's what we don't want. And that's what generally happens. And we've made this mistake as developers over and over and over. We constantly make this mistake. Everybody has their own login routine. Everybody has their own error routine processing. Everybody has their own access to get the customer address. So understanding domains and understanding how APIs should be structured within your organization and how you can break it out and allow ownership of certain domains is critical to an API first architecture.
I agree.
Yes. So, the other thing I want to just tack on to it is, what are your APIs doing? What's the purpose? And in the old days, you would just write your software, you would be in a UI, you would be, either web-based where everything's all self-contained, and then you started pulling apart doing the APIs. To now, when you're developing software, you're thinking about it, there's multiple facets you have to think about. Are you going to expose any aspect of it for reporting or business to business? Or are you going to be consumed by other tools internally for any reason? Or what's the UI going to be? The UI in today's world, when you're thinking of an application, if you're thinking of just web, you're being very short-sighted. Do you want to go web-based? Do you want to go mobile-based? Or other technologies out there? And as Chris said, talking about you may have an application that is nothing pure APIs, and that's okay because it's all about the usage and what you're actually trying to accomplish.
Agreed. When I hear API first, to me, there's sort of a chicken and the egg question there, right? What comes before the API, or is the API first the chicken? And no, it's not the chicken. I think first, before you don't start with the API. First, you start with sort of plan of, hey, I want an application that does this, that, or this, and this, right? And then we think about, okay, how am I going to go about doing that, right? So I think the planning and, laying out, storyboarding, if you will, or designing of the app is first. But certainly, once we get into that design, we start thinking about APIs and potential APIs, I think, before we start coding, certainly. Would you agree that is the essence of API first, right? Before we even start coding, we're thinking about how APIs are going to make or break, or how they're going to work within the app that we're designing.
Yeah, because that's how APIs are going to pay for themselves. Me as a young developer, I would have loved to had, been we talk about feature teams now, instead of application teams, you have feature teams. Well, me as a feature team working on a particular, what would be delivered as an application, I get to go talk to other teams that are doing features, which means I don't have to write all those queries. I can figure out what they already have. If it's a well-organized API structure and everybody can share those APIs. So that pays it for itself. It's, APIs can save a whole lot of cash when it comes to development because you're reusing objects. So 100%. And it has to do with money too.
Yeah, it does do that.
If I could talk on that, just because the plan triggers me, right, is it immediately makes me go to the service definition, which I'm sure a lot of the seasoned guys here are going to roll their eyes, right? The service definition is not a plan, but a lot of organizations say this is the beginning of the process. Right? Let's write our service definition. Let's write our contracts. Let's start putting in place the actual semantics of what this API is going to do. And what's interesting, if I kind of double click on what Tracy was saying about the domain and specifically what Mitch was saying about sprawl, this creates a problem because you're not doing that upfront ideation work to say, what is the minimum set of APIs that we need in order to provide the value that will ultimately provide the money to our organization? And this leads to something which I'm seeing a ton right now, which is API, and new API is the answer to everything, all right? Okay, we got this new functionality. Let's just add another API. Let's add another API. And before you know it, you have this massive API sprawl. And so I really do think coming back to the domain and the why and the minimum set is super critical to this, to the planning phase before the service definition is even put in place.
So you're saying we can replace the phrase "there's an app for that" to "there's an API for that"?
API for that.
Yeah. Well, and Chris, the thing that comes to mind when you were talking about that is solid programming principles, right? So, when you create a class, you create a method, the goal is I've created it, I can add to it, but I cannot change it. And when you look at APIs, you may run into, I need a little bit more or a little bit changed or a little bit something. And so now, your sprawl becomes version 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, and so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden, to everybody's comment here, all of a sudden you may have started off with, 150, 200 API endpoints, and now you're well over 1,000.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, it really, APIs, even though they save a lot, like microservices, is complex because you're decoupling pieces. And when you decouple pieces, you create, it's your puzzle now is in, you don't have the top of the box to tell you what that puzzle is supposed to be. And you have all these components, all these tiny puzzle pieces laying on the, on the table, and you got to figure out what it is that you're creating. So
that's when
if you
the
don't have
blast radius gets really large, Tracy, right?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Blast radius.
Here we go.
But that's an interesting aspect too, right? And it becomes that, yes, I have this giant inventory of APIs and I may want to, Chris's point, sort of just add incremental functionality to it and change its version number. But in a lot of cases, the APIs are used by disparate teams. And so they might not know. The major difference between the UI and the API is the UIs are designed to explicitly tell you what it's doing. You go to the screen, you get it. Okay, I'm logging in, I'm creating an account. APIs will do the same thing, but they're not explicit. And unless you love reading Swagger definitions, you can't immediately know what an API is doing. And so that's where I think a part of that sprawl comes through, is people go, hey, I don't think this functionality exists. It's like, well, actually, yes, it is. It's a subset of this other API and so I think this is one of the challenges that I think the contracts and service definitions, and definitely to Tracy's point, the conversationing around what exactly are these APIs for becomes paramount to an organization's API success.
Right. Well, and as an API matures, then what happens too, just like you were saying, you may have certain aspects of multiple pieces of APIs. Hey, to accomplish this task, I have to hit 7 different APIs to get all the data. And one API may take forever to run, and I just need one aspect of its data. However, a lot of it is actually tied to the same background or, the back end. And so instead, maybe I just create a new endpoint to pull what I need. And the next thing you know, again, sprawl.
And it's a collaboration that will prevent the sprawl.
Yes.
You have to have the collaboration. You have to be, if you don't know an API exists, and there's no way to find out, you're going to write it yourself, because you might go, this is going to take me, it will take me 30 minutes to write it, even though that's not true. We do that, as opposed to go hunt down somebody who's already written one. So the collaboration is essential, just across teams, much less really building out a collaborative API structure.
Couple things there. First of all, I think that was job one in the API security arms race. When API security started becoming a thing, I think the first thing these API security solutions were doing was saying, it's 10 o'clock. Do you know what APIs you have? Right? Because, the API sprawl gave us so many APIs, and APIs talking APIs that most organizations really did not have a handle on what APIs were interacting in and within their system or on their system, and let alone what their settings were, their security posture, etc. You can't defend what you don't even know is there. Mm-hmm. And that was phase one of API security. I think it's expanded beyond that, it's matured, but that was certainly the first kind of thing about it. The first part of API security. I want to turn, beyond the blast radius of API security, of API first, and talk about API testing, right? Because, that's the logical next step. Okay, so now we are going with an API first mentality. We're going to have these APIs that are, in the right from the design phase, we are designing APIs in. But of course, these APIs need to be tested, don't they? You hope. And So you have to get into API testing. But yet, when I hear the phrase API testing, I still think of, oh, I'm using APIs to do my testing, right? It sort of adds a layer of automation to my testing. But no, that's not really what I think we're talking about.
Yeah, I
Chris,
think most.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Chase. No, you go, Chase.
I was just going to say, I think when we talk about API testing from a developer's perspective, I think about functional testing and validation testing. I don't worry about performance testing or security testing or load balancing or any of those other pieces. I assume somebody's going to automate that.
Yeah, that's
what we do, right? I'm going to validate my endpoints. I'm going to do my functional testing. If that's good, I'm going.
That's security testing.
Yeah.
Chris L, I'm hoping you have a different attitude towards it.
I do. I'm sorry, Tracy.
It's okay.
My attitude is, it's a view into your system, and as such, you need to do multiple things. I go to conferences, I see applications, I talk to people. I with penetration testing software, I enjoy going out and attacking and breaking things. I love seeing, what kind of data I can get back. Some systems, you can easily break simply because improper security, improper logging, improper a lot of things. And so when you're looking at APIs from, a standpoint, there's multiple aspects that you have to consider. How does it perform? Because I can come in and do a denial of service attack. If you have a poor performing API, I can call it multiple times from thousands of endpoints simultaneously. If you have an API endpoint that shares data that it shouldn't be sharing, now I can steal data. If you have an API endpoint that is just not well put together, it's very obvious from a security standpoint. And so whenever I was actually doing my development days and doing senior tech reviews, I would look at, how do they perform? I would look at using tools to look at the payload as it goes in, as it comes out, what kind of things, time to run, the time on the back end, on the database, all the way down to that level, just to ensure that, is this performing? Is it doing what it has? And beyond that, you also have the security things that you can throw in there, such as SQL injection and other various things that can happen. I'll stop. I can keep going, but
no, I get it. Chris C., you're the real tester here. What do you think?
Okay, first off, I'm in the vendor space, right? And so nobody knows less about testing than the actual testing vendors. But I will say this. I am encouraged that we're talking about development forward API testing, because quite often in the testing industry, that's put firmly on QA. And there's these really interesting conversations whenever we go to a first-time API tester where they go, well, whose responsibility is it? Is it the developer? Is it the tester? Now, we all know it's both, but it's at a spectrum. And the notion is that, hey, I'm a developer. I created a service definition. I should be able to hand that to the tester. They should be able to ingest that and use it. And the tester says, hey, you're a developer. You're building the API. You should test it before you give it to me. And there's this constant back and forth. And I think to both Tracy and Chris's points, there's different levels of testing that you do as it's maturing through the cycle. And the first one, to me, is contract testing, right? I want to make sure that my service that I'm building is not only complying to my business expectations that I've set forth for the function of this API, but also that the consumers of it are not going to be affected if I change it, right? And so I don't know if anybody's really grasped onto contract testing quite like some companies like Pact have, but it's this really strong grassroots movement that's happening right now because it's developer forward that basically says, I'm only going to write into this tests from a development coded perspective that are my expectations of an API. That way I can continue to do what I'm doing and know that if the producer of the API makes a change, they're going to run my contract and know that they've broken me, which fosters collaboration and communication. Those contracts are the seed for everything because you can mature those into greater and greater levels of more complicated functional and integration testing. And then once you have all of those contracts, you have all the attack vectors that you need for your security testing. So I really think that this whole testing thing starts from the moment that first line of code is written against a contract, write the contract. But again, it's all predicated on whether the service definition exists.
Isn't also, because I remember us using kind of contract with APIs in a little more general way before this movement you're talking about. And really a contract in that sense was, here's how you use the API. Here's the expected behavior in terms of how you interface with it. And here's the expected behaviors of what it's going to do when you use it in the specified ways. And I think to your point is, if you go wacky and do some SQL ingestion, or you do something else and pass different parameters that aren't part of the API, it's not going to respond, or it's going to give you an error or some definition that's out of bounds of the contract. Is that still consistent with the movement you're talking, the developer forward?
Yes, the contract is, again, it's an overloaded term, as are many things in our industry, but to me, the contract of the API is the service definition that defines semantically and logically what this API is supposed to do. And you can use that both as a human document to read, to understand, but probably more handing it to the business, to the appliance, so that it can ingest it and create clients to actually communicate with the API. That contract needs to be tested. Is it semantically valid? Does it follow all of the spec definitions that we have for service definitions? Has it changed recently, et cetera, et cetera? And then that component is then used to test the function of the API in its entirety. This is a second piece to that, which is I'm using the API in a very specific way, and I have complied to the service definition. I'm doing everything right. I want to know if anything has changed. Or if what I'm trying to do and what's critical to my business, I'm Bank of America, I'm communicating with a PayPal API, I'm only using like 3 fields of it. Don't change those 3 fields. And do whatever you want with it, as long as you don't change those 3 fields. And if you do change those 3 fields, you got to talk to me and say, I'm changing the 3 fields. What can we do about it? What can we do about it? That's the difference between those 2 types of testing.
And there's something that happens when APIs aren't really tested well. There is a trust factor that we have to always keep in mind if you're an API developer, to make sure that you're doing that testing and that you're maintaining those contracts. Because what happens is, in that example that Chris just gave, that consumer may decide not to take on that new version of an API. And that causes a DevOps nightmare called drift, which means you have multiple versions of your API that are out in the world or being consumed internally by many different application teams that you have to support, maintain, and make sure are secure. So the API testing is so critical in building that trust, so you don't end up with so much drift. We talked about sprawl. Sprawl is a problem. But drift is as big a problem, if not bigger, when it comes to trying to secure the environment.
Right. And then one of the things that I've seen is a lot of QA departments use automated regression tools. And their thought is, hey, my tool passed, it regression tested. That must mean the APIs are good. Let's move on and let's consider it good. And to both Chris and Tracy, their point is, look, the contracts possibly could change internally. Something could get added, modified, a definition may change. And, the drift starts happening because all of a sudden you have companies that are still using version 1.0 and now you're version 30 and you can't get off of it. And by default, most people who are writing APIs are not logging or doing any metrics. And when you're not doing any metrics, you're not knowing what API endpoints are being used, how they're being used. You don't know the details. And so the problem becomes, you're sitting there, you're creating drift, sprawl, and you don't know that, hey, guess what? Version 1 is still being used, but versions 2 through 15 aren't and haven't been for a given time. And so those could be deprecated. So instead, at a certain point, depending on design and what's going on, you may have to go make 30, 40, 50 changes, spread that same change out across all the API endpoints, where if you were paying attention and doing good development practices and analytics would tell you, hey, you have people that aren't moving off version 1. Why? Ask the why. What's going on there? and then determine, can they move up, or is it just a breaking code change for them? And if it is, how do you deal with that, and how do you work with that? Because at a certain point, you need to move forward.
So, but this is a bigger problem you're touching on, Chris, right? This is the sprawl aspect of it. We see it, cloud sprawl, API sprawl. Are all developers and IT people hoarders at their core? Maybe, because none of us seem to want to delete anything. Me, I find a certain joy in like cleaning out my closet and throwing out things that, I have a rule in the house. If it hasn't been used in the last year and a half, we're probably not going to use it. There's better things to do with that space. Do we need to? And that's, by the way, that's something we could automate with APIs. And if that forces people to move off of version 1 to version 5 because they've been sleeping through the last 4 upgrades or refuse to do it, so be it, right? People used to knock Apple for that because they stopped with the backwards compatibility for 5-year-old software. If you didn't have the last version or 2, the heck with you. You couldn't run the latest stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Microsoft stuck to that backwards compatibility thing for too long, in my opinion. Is good API hygiene meaning adopt something like that?
Wow, that's a cultural shift, because I do think that developers tend to be a bit hoarder, as you explain. Yes. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about even building a container for an API. You're probably going to bring in stuff that you don't even need because you're not sure if there's a dependency on it, which is part of our current security problems, is these transitive dependencies, and what APIs calls what API becomes more of an issue. So it would be hard to get folks to start really cleaning house.
I mean, think about SBOMs. You mentioned SBOMs.
SBOMs. I was not going to say SBOMs, but
well, no, we're
I
not
think that.
On
okay, but I do think that AI could help solve our blast radius.
Okay, blast radius it is.
So we're talking about blast radius, so we could use AI to do that.
We could use AI to limit the blast radius, but shouldn't we use AI to just limit API sprawl?
And drift. Yes.
And drift. I mean, it's good security, I think.
Well, and AI is doing so many amazing things today. From a standpoint, when you're looking at using AI against your APIs, it now creates a lot of, background. It gives you a lot of visibility in the things that you didn't have before. It makes it so much easier to connect, to get that information, to know what's happening behind the scenes, and to be able to detect anomalies. You may be up and running and AI can go, hey, guess what? I'm noticing something interesting. Or, if you are doing logging or whatever, AI can also pinpoint and go, hey, wait a second, something's happening. Tracy, she lives here, and somewhere on the other side of the globe, Tracy logged in again. Problem.
One thing I want to bring up, Alan, is there's also kind of we're talking about some challenges with managing this whole ecosystem, right, of APIs. One thing that I think is really great about APIs, Tracy, you were talking about C++, remembering back in the day of stubbing off methods. We would here's the structure, and I don't have time to write that yet, so I'll just put a return in there and pass some data back. And now we have such a better way of not just stubbing, but actually creating the API, creating some logic behind it. We can have, some tests actually built into that code that isn't fully been written there yet. But maybe it's generating responses, right, that we want to be able to test with as part of that API, as well as we add the function, the service of what it is. And so I think you can build software faster through this API first approach, because you're not managing a big structure, a big object structure with parts stubbed out and some parts not, and who's got what part of that tree. And I'm using this version of this microservice, this API, and it's just stubbed there. It's great for building and testing, and I'm going to replace it with Chris's, whichever Chris wrote it, Chris CRL, and I can continue to just evolve the app that way. Agree? Don't agree?
I agree.
Doing funny stuff in Colorado, or?
I gotta jump in here. Like, one of the things I said at the beginning with my introduction was that I'm over two products, right? API testing and service virtualization. And I don't get to say this very often, but service virtualization doesn't get the love that it needs in our space. And I think that from an API first perspective, it is massively important for jumpstarting, any API initiative. And to kind of wrap this into the sprawl and the drift thing, observability can be a huge benefit here, right? Because what we're finding when we're going to a lot of our companies is they're like, we want to do this. We want to go API first. We want to test what we currently have. We want to understand what people are using, but we have no idea what APIs we have anymore, right? Because everybody's kind of cycled out, et cetera. And observability allows you to not only observe the system under motion to understand the actual APIs that are there, because guess what? A lot of those internal ones that Tracy was mentioning earlier, they're not documented. There's no service definition for them. And the observability is the only way you're going to pick up on those. And that same traffic can be used to generate those initial service tests, those initial virtual services, which is so much more valuable because it's not just a dumb stub. It's one that actually simulates the business logic and the expectations of the system under motion. And then you kind of build your new API scaffolding around that. And it's a great way to get started, is leverage your existing observability for service test and service virtualization creation.
I love that term, your service under motion. It's a great visual.
Service in motion.
Service in motion. Yes.
No, it's under motion.
It's great.
I was just running with something.
In an 80s song.
It makes sense, right?
Yeah.
It does.
There's another part to this too, and that is the API security, APISec. Part of security is one of the first things is API discovery. So if things are going through a proxy or something that's flowing through, whether you call it a firewall, a proxy, whatever it might be, that's another collection point, if you will, like you're talking about, Chris C. What is that? There's 25 things that happened today. Nobody knows what that thing is, or didn't know somebody else was using that way. We didn't know that was going externally. So that's another kind of data point you can pull into figuring out what's happening.
Well, I had mentioned that earlier. You can't defend what you don't know. Most people don't know what APIs you have.
Well,
from the SBOM, I'm sorry. From the SBOM piece of it, you don't know what dependencies that API is calling into play here. Chris L., you got something to say. Go ahead.
Yes. So, when you're looking at the APIs and the data coming in, it's just like a UI. You have no idea what kind of crap people are going to throw at it, what length of information people are going to throw at it, what kind of information is inbound, outbound, because crafting a good attack, you can do things and skirt under the radar depending on design. And I love what Mitch was saying, the very first thing, if I'm going to come attack you guys and look at what's going on, I'm going to figure out what API endpoints you have. I'm going to figure out what's going on there. And then I'm going to start, overloading them, seeing what I can come up with. And it's amazing how many people overlook the role-based access. If you get a JWT token, you get in the door, guess what? Now I can do a lot of things that I shouldn't be able to.
Fair enough. Guys, we try to keep these sessions to 40, 45 minutes, and I think we're up against the clock here. First of all, great conversation. Great conversation. I think, look, for our audience at home, takeaways, three things. I always like to leave these kinds of things with three key takeaways. Number one, we absolutely do live in an API economy, right? APIs are driving the internet, it seems, if we look at traffic loads. Number two, an API first mindset in how we plan and develop our applications is, I think, the norm, not the exception today, right? Do we all agree with that? And the third thing is, if all of these APIs are out there, if you're not doing API testing, and that includes API security testing, what comes home to roost, Mitchell?
Chickens can home to
The
roost.
chickens come home to roost. I knew it was some fowl.
That's the
the
Nebraska
chickens
boy.
come-
You'll get
That's
it.
the Nebraska boy right there. And of course, it expands your blast radius. But,
Hey, all right.
Well done.
last time.
I realized we gave nobody any context at the beginning as to why we were doing that, and I love it.
I do
No,
too.
we have a very, very sharp audience. They picked up right away on it, but it's not the first time they played this drinking game. Anyway, Chris and Chris, thank you so much for being our guest today on DevOps Unbound. Tracy, as always, it's a pleasure to have you on here. Love having you part of, not just DevOps Unbound, but you're one of the gang members, some TechStrong gang, and of course, TechStrong women and everything else you guys do. So thank you. Mitch, as always, you take the last word.
My just parting thought is there's an API for that. Enough said.
Fair
Mic drop.
enough.
No doubt.
Hey, many thanks to Tricentis, as I said in the beginning of the show, for sponsoring this. They're a great company to work with. Check them out, tricentis.com. Until next time, this is Alan Shimel for TechStrong. Quick reminder, July 24th is our next live roundtable. Don't miss it. But until then, or until our next show here, we're out. Thank you. Bye-bye.